Friends. I didn't sleep well last night. I fell asleep on my couch while I was watching 1917. And you might be asking, why is this relevant? I'm actually asking the same question as well, but the thing is, I always watch 1917 because it's A, one of my favorite wartime movies, and B, because it's full of inspiration and cool little details. So how is World War I supposed to be related to Maschinenkrieger, which is the main topic of this video? First of all, I just finished this little scene and it gave me inspiration to try something similar, because my original plan was to build another tank, a pretty cool one actually, but I'm probably gonna build it after this project. So what is this all about? Well, my friends at the Plastic Posse podcast sent me a cool little gift. I wanted to build it by the book, so to say. Basically honoring the in-universe rules of this genre. So my plan was to go with the camouflage from the box art. And then, I don't even know, I got this idea, like, what if I put this suit into a World War I trench? And then I thought, what if I painted it in a World War I German tank scheme? But what's gonna be really cool are the decals, because I have some leftovers from my SA7V from Menk, basically just large crosses, but even more interestingly, skulls from a Whippet. And I'm hoping that this large one, or maybe the smaller ones, are gonna fit on the suit's head. And if that turns out as a success, I think it's gonna be the coolest thing ever. Now, does it make sense to have a high-tech, cast metal, diesel punk armor suit situated in World War I? Definitely not. Do I care? Even more not. So, I don't know. I don't want to drag this intro any longer because I think we are all shaking in our boots to see how this all turns out. So, let's just go to my studio and get to work, okay? So the main protagonist is the Melusine, and I wanted to get my first Maschinenkrieger experience as fresh as it gets. In other words, I started building the model following the kit instructions. However, I quickly recognized a few places that could be improved before I even glued something together, namely enlarging the panel lines with a scriber. I was expecting a Tamiya-like building experience with an excellent fit, but I was quite taken aback by how tight the fit was in some places. For example, here on the main shell, I couldn't get the two halves together without applying some serious brute force, and as you see, by serious I mean a pipe wrench. But hey, we all love seeing little improvements and modifications on our kits, and here's one part that's a prime estate for scratch building. It's sweet to have flexible parts made from hard rubber, but it's not so cool when you're trying to clean up the seam lines. It's actually impossible, so you can either live with that or make new parts. I went the second route, and that meant a pretty fresh experience, coiling large and very long springs. I used a large diameter copper wire as a jig and twisted a 0.3mm wire around it using an AC drill. It's actually a pretty satisfying process once you get used to it, and you can wind an extremely long coil without any issues. This is a technique that will definitely come in handy again in the future on some armor models. But here, it's representing an armored hose, so I inserted a length of lead wire inside, and to finish the part, I removed the contact points from the original hose and superglued them into my brand new replacement. Lo and behold, an awesome looking, shiny, custom-made armored hose that's flexible. Anyone who's built or just seen a Maschinenkrieger model online knows that this genre goes hand in hand with cast armor textures. Pretty much every suit in this universe is made from cast metal parts, and that makes them a prime playground for rough metal textures. Tamiya putty diluted with modeling cement is excellent for this, and I tried to vary its thickness on different parts to add some life to the model. It's sometimes easier to deepen the panel lines afterward because the putty can get into them, and that would be just more unnecessary work later down the road. One of the most important steps in this process is the gentle polishing that makes the texture more realistic, but also more evident. Using a superfine sanding sponge, I level out some of the protruding imperfections, giving it a... it's hard to describe. It looks way better, okay? And another advantage of this, because it's diluted putty, it can be used to fill some of the uneven gaps. And once it dries, I could very carefully scribe new, much better looking panel lines, such as around this engine cover. Again, because the entire model is about cast textures, I tried to make them look slightly different on each part, sometimes smoother, in other places really gnarly. Cast parts are usually welded together, and that brings me to the next technique, adding weld beads with green stuff 2-part putty. I rolled it into thin noodles, although I had to keep in mind that this model is in 1/20th scale, not in my usual 1/35th, so everything, including the weld detail, should be slightly bigger. Because there's not much surface detail here, I was able to apply the putty around everything and then texture it all at once. Obviously, there are no reference pictures, so I tried to apply the welds in logical places. To add some variety, I combined the typical single bevel welds that are seen on most German armor from World War II with some multiple pass ones, more common on Soviet and Allied tanks, although you can find them on German tanks as well. And even though I tried to work reasonably, I got carried away, because as I later found out, this right here is a cover for the fuel tank, and I welded it shut. I know, not cool, but I didn't know at the time. Other than that, I only added a few more details, such as electric wires for the cameras, I made these from lead wire, and also a bunch of bolts punched from a plastic sheet. I replaced every bolt that was on the model, because most of them were quite soft and shallow, and I also added a bunch more, just to make the surface more intricate. Then I could finally put those metal hoses to good use, but I quickly learned that they were quite fragile, so I had to be very careful while bending them to shape. But yeah, it was a worthy upgrade, they look much better than the rubber ones. The last thing that bugged me was the flexible rubber joints. These are also impossible to clean, and I was almost ready to accept them for what they were until it was pointed out on my Patreon that it's much better to cover them with putty. This has two huge advantages. The putty allows you to pose the suit and lock the pose in place, and the second, obvious one, is that your own sculpted joints are gonna be much smoother and look more intricate. Honestly, I don't have much sculpting experience, and the little that I have revolves exclusively around rolling tarps from putty, and that's a completely different process. So it was a very good and welcome exercise, and it's actually not very difficult. A toothpick and a couple of silicone sculpting brushes, and the result is gonna be, I'd say, pretty nice. I even added some rudimentary seam lines to make them look more detailed, because when you put in the work, why not make the most out of it, right? So, that's the Melusine all fired up for some action in the trenches, and as I was building it, I had this strange feeling, because I couldn't decide if it feels more like an armor model or like a figure. But anyway, the suit feels lonely, so let's build a nice trench diorama for it, starting with a simple 3D sketch made from styrofoam. Here I started with the bottom of the trench, because this is where the suit needs to be pressed firmly into the ground, and I also need to make some shoe imprints to indicate foot traffic. As such, I started by reinforcing the styrofoam with AK's earth paste. Then, when it dried, I covered the surface with Smart Mud from VMS. It's soft, sandy compound, and it's excellent for sculpting terrain features and making various imprints. I quickly sprinkled it with real earth from my garden, trademark, to add some realistic texture, but more importantly, to make it less sticky. I printed these World War I military boots, which I found for free on Thingiverse, and I used them as a stamp for that sweet texture. VMS clay is really amazing, and you can get it directly through VMS or through Michigan Toy Soldier Company, and if you use the promo code MFRIENDS2023 and you're a registered user, you'll get a 15% discount on everything from MishToy. Once I was happy with the shoe prints and the suit was pressed in place as well, I soaked the whole surface with alcohol, which breaks the Earth's surface tension, and then I covered it with diluted PVA glue, which would otherwise bead up on the surface. But thanks to the alcohol, the ground absorbs it evenly like a sponge. Now for the trench wall, starting at the bottom with some corrugated metal. I already had some jigs from my Conqueror project, but these are too small and I had to make new ones in 1/20th scale. I like working with copper because it's reliable, durable, and I have plenty of the stuff. But first, I need to make it softer using a process called annealing, basically softening the metal temporarily with heat. Now, using the jig and some brute force provided by a pipe wrench, I can make my own realistic sheets of corrugated metal. The process is very fast, and if you're a diorama modeler, I highly recommend making a similar jig for yourself. Once I added some additional sweet details in the form of bullet holes and some tears in the metal, I fixed them to the wall with superglue. Up next are the planks, and I made these from 2mm thick strips of balsa wood. The planks used in trenches were quite sturdy, and this seemed like a pretty accurate thickness. I've cut each length individually and only then added the wood grain texture with a rough file. This way I could also round the edges and make the wood look old and well used, as if it was taken from an old barn or something similar. Here I had to make sure the planks would sit perfectly flush with the sides of the base, so I marked them with a pen under the desired angle, and after cutting them to shape, I used a piece of veneer to make sure they'll be absolutely, undoubtedly, undeniably, perfectly flush. It would save me a lot of trouble later down the road. Finally, to make the wood less fuzzy and also reinforce it a little, I flooded them all with diluted glue. The planks also won't act like a sponge once I start painting them. Now comes the most boring but most rewarding part of the process, laminating the sides of the diorama. I like to use 0.4mm oak veneer because it's very sturdy and discreet. As in, it doesn't expand the diorama too much because it's so thin. The easiest way for me, which seems to be working pretty well, is tracing a rough outline of the terrain on each side and then cutting it out, again very roughly with a pair of scissors. Then it's just a matter of adding some double-sided tape while leaving the edges clean and pressing it hard against the styrofoam skeleton of the diorama. The bond is strong and instant, which means I can immediately remove the excess wood. The veneer is very hard, so I like to make it easier on my hands, especially my fingers, by removing most of the material with a rotary tool. This takes a while, but it's quite reliable. And then I finish the job by carefully slicing away the remaining material with a hobby plate, precisely tracing the outlines of every feature in the diorama. A bit of sanding will remove the fuzzy bits, and our reward will be a professional-looking, seamless surface. Note how I left some excess veneer at the top, so I can adjust it once I add the remaining features. So, actually, let's get right into that and sculpt a whole bunch of sandbags. In fact, it'll be an entire wall made from bags, and for this, I think the best material is Magic Sculpt Putty. It has different properties than green stuff or Tamiya, and most importantly, you get a lot of it in the packaging. The other two putties that I mentioned are more rubbery and flexible, while this one acts more like clay. I only sculpted sandbags once or twice in my life, so my experience with them is very limited to say the least. But the overall workflow is very simple. You just need to roll a thick worm from the putty and cut it into the approximate length of the sandbag. This will already give you a rough shape, which can be refined further with your fingers. Once I had these very simple bags, I placed them in the diorama, pressing them down to show their weight. I had to work in sections, and the most I could sculpt at the time were 4 or 5. So the first step is to smooth out their surface and get rid of any imperfections and fingerprints. This can be done with a flat or slightly rounded silicone sculpting brush, and it lets you become familiar with the material. Then the real fun begins, adding the various folds and textures. A rounded, pointy sculpting brush is ideal for that, but this cut down, triangle sort of shaped brush is also pretty good. Actually, I used two different kinds. These large black ones are from Green Stuff World, and they're pretty sturdy, ideal for sculpting large and rough shapes. I also have a set of these smaller brushes from AK Interactive, and they're very soft. Very good for sculpting small details or just refining what we already have. The thing about sandbags is that they're usually pretty featureless, but I try to add at least something. So there would be at least some detail I could paint and highlight. Once I was done with their basic shape and the putty started to solidify, I used a sharp blade to carve out the seam line running along every bag. This acts as a guide for the actual seams that I sculpted from Green Stuff and rolled into noodles the same way as I usually do with weld beads. Of course, the bags have to be rock hard at this stage. And the final detail is the tight knot at the top. I made these by rolling the powdered putty into a thin pancake, the same way I make tarps, and then I cut it into small strips. Each strip was then rolled into this small flower, I guess, or an ice cream cone, and I pressed them into holes that I sculpted beforehand. It's actually fairly easy, but not all of these details are necessary if you're creating sandbags in smaller scales. It also goes to show how different putties have different properties, and thus each is suitable for something else. Okay, so now I could integrate them into the diorama with some more real earth from my garden, trademark, especially filling all the gaps between them. It was all fixed in place using the same method, soaking the surface with alcohol and then dripping diluted PVA glue. I added larger clumps of earth on top of the trench for added texture, and with the groundwork finished, I could add the final details. This improvised telegraph pole was made from balsa wood and toothpicks, and I took direct inspiration from the movie I mentioned at the beginning of this video, the one I fell asleep to. Also, I added a sign on the wall made from veneer, and I also made some details on my 3D printer. These had to be post-processed, which is a fancy word for sanding and filling. Basically just getting rid of the printing texture, that's all. I found these shovels for free on Thingiverse, and they're a very nice addition to any diorama. I also took this inspiration from the movie, and the flimsy cans in the background are my own creation. You can actually download them from my Patreon page if you'd like, but anyway, that's pretty much our finished diorama ready for painting. And we all know that's where the real fun's at, so let's move next door to my painting workbench, okay? I didn't want to spend a couple of hours priming with an airbrush, so I used my trusty Mr. Black surface primer in a rattle can. There is no exposed styrofoam anywhere in sight, so I wasn't worried it would damage something. It's super fast and has great coverage. The only downside? The smell. You better spray it outside or wear some kind of particle mask for your own protection. However, the result is nice and smooth, an excellent base for painting. I usually like to start with the model, but this time I had a taste for some groundwork, so I decided to start with the diorama. Last time, on my Warsaw 1944 diorama, I sprayed and finished each element separately. For some reason, I went the same route again, starting with the corrugated metal. I decided to paint the rusty surface completely with AK's new acrylic paints because it's a pretty fast process. The point is to have the paints heavily diluted with tap water, work in layers, and have a bunch of reference pictures at hand. Here I used 3 different photos because I wanted each plate to have a completely different finish, but the base coat for all of them is the same. Just a bunch of rust stones blended over each other, with some speckling for good measure. And now, the process varies for each panel, but I'll focus on this one. What I saw in my reference picture looks like a mill scale, but it's more likely some kind of corrosion or possibly just remnants of paint. I didn't want to bother with an airbrush and chipping fluid and went the old school way, painting with a brush because, well, it's faster. Now I had to tone the effect down with more acrylic washes, but this time my application was more selective and controlled, focusing mainly on the edges to smoothen out the color transitions. Pure white was used as chipping over chipping to give the texture a more three-dimensional look. It's a lot of fun to create these often complex finishes with basic painting techniques. The final touch was adding runs of what appears to be slag or tar from one side. This indicates that the plate used to be a part of an old roof. At least I guess. Anyway, here are all three of them. The middle one is covered in moss and lichen, and the left one has a darker, cold steel finish. It might look like there's too much contrast at the moment, but it's all gonna be blended nicely later down the road. The next milestone in this journey was painting all the wooden surfaces. Here I felt a bit unsure, so I prepared way more acrylics than I actually needed. After a bunch of experiments, I found a method that seemed to work pretty well. Basically, it was about applying heavy washes of brown and gray acrylics directly on top of the black primer, varying the color on each plank. Again, I had a bunch of reference pictures in front of me so I could find and replicate at least a few interesting details. Old faded wood is rarely brown or sandy. In fact, it fades into grayish, in some cases white or black tones. The only thing you can use to add a splash of color is often moss, or rust, or maybe some dirt. Anyway, not all acrylic washes are made equal, and I rarely applied them over the entire plank. This is where my references come in handy, and I could try to replicate those various stains and discoloration in the wood. Sometimes I added a shadow gradient towards the bottom, and sometimes a lighter faded color towards the top. I'm a huge fan of moss in dioramas, and this was the perfect spot for this effect, also painted with acrylics. I added nail sponge from tinfoil, so I wanted to make sure they'll be nicely visible. Some carefully applied acrylic rust washes did the job, while also bringing more color variation to the table. And as a finishing touch, I used a pointy paintbrush and a sandy color to add some faint scratches, imitating wood grain texture. This was also added to the worn edges of each plank. Tree trunks were treated using the same methods, and here I had to use the natural bark texture and bring the most out of it with paints. Luckily, the bark is usually very desaturated as well, so I could use the same color palette. Okay, that's the wood out of the way, and even though I did my best here, I wasn't convinced by the result. If you're not either, you might find out it's because the grayish tones, combined with the black primer, are kinda boring, but that's all gonna change when the diorama is finished. So the next step is painting those meticulously sculpted sandbags, and here I wanted to use my pre-shading / glazing method. This means spraying them from above with a very pale color, something like deck tan from Tamiya. Flat white is too intense and leads to not so authentic results, but the point remains the same. Spray the lights from above, letting the black primer create shadows. And then I could mix a bunch of browns, greens and yellows into highly diluted glazes. A glaze is basically a color filter, but definitely not a wash, so while applying it, it's important to avoid flooding the details. We want the paint to be distributed evenly over the entire surface, and to achieve the right opacity, 2 to maybe 3 layers have to be applied. Not too many layers and you'll have a desaturated unnatural finish, too many and you'll lose the contrast. I went a bit overboard with the color variation, but as you'll see, it can always be toned down. Now, next I outlined the details, in this case just the seam lines, with a relatively opaque black-brown color mixture. I used the same paint, although more diluted, to enhance all the shadows. The point isn't to apply the shadow color into every fold, but actually underneath it, where the sun would naturally cast shadows. And now I could do the opposite, pick out the seam lines and apply highlights. These were all mixed from the base color used on each sandbag and a bit of light earth. I found it very difficult to paint smooth color transition on these unremarkable surfaces. Honestly, figures are much easier to paint because of their intricate details, but no matter the problem, there's always some kind of trick waiting to get you out of trouble. And in this case, it was another layer of very diluted glazes. Not only I could smoothen out the transitions with harsh edges, but I also unified some of those unnatural colors, because British sandbags usually had an earthy khaki color. So, that's the result of my struggle, and honestly, I'm not disappointed at all. The bigger scale is less forgivable, and with my limited experience, I think they turned out quite alright. Okay, now for the moment of truth. Painting the ground and tying all these elements together. Honestly, I should have just airbrushed every piece of the diorama first, and then treat them with paintbrushes. It definitely would have saved me a lot of insecurity, as I'd have a better idea about the final result. But anyway, I started by giving it a fairly translucent coat of flat earth, leaving some of the black primer showing through here and there. Then I gave it a couple of highlight layers made from the flat earth and dark yellow, because I wanted to shift the tone to a slightly warmer spectrum than usual. I usually paint my World War I dioramas in very dull, desaturated tones to enhance their atmosphere, but here, I just went with the flow. And look at that, all it needed was some basic colors on the ground and the desaturated planks. In fact, everything looks right at home. That was a huge weight lifted off my shoulders, my friends, so I could merrily continue with my painting efforts. Although I love painting dioramas with acrylic paints, I'm still more comfortable with enamels when it comes to the groundwork. They're just easier and quicker to apply over such a large, complex, and most importantly, absorbent surface. Again, my usual color palette is less saturated, but here I went with 3 colors from AK. Kursk Earth, the light one, which is very warm. Then Dark Mud, this one is more grayish, and darker. They make a nice blend and add subtle variety to the ground. And the darkest shadow tone was Track Wash. I know, it's intended for tank tracks, but I found the tone excellent for adding deep shadows and stains of moisture. Of course, the bottom of the trench will be wet, so it has to be darker. As such, I used primarily the 2 darker colors here. On the opposite end, the parapet of the trench received more of a lighter tone, which was also used to further blend the sandbags into the groundwork. And here I also employed some speckling to add stains of mud. I mean, sandbags used to be all covered in mud and all kinds of horribleness anyway, but this is just a part of the process. What really makes the groundwork pop for me is when time and care are taken to selectively pick out all the various clumps of earth and stones with acrylic paints. These can range from dark browns to very light grays, and unlike my previous dioramas, here I used a very unusual color to completely change the look of the ground. It was pointed out in my A7V diorama that the ground has a different color the deeper you dig, and it's common to see very unusual colors in the trenches. After watching 1917 again, I knew exactly what they meant, and there were a lot of rich, orange tones in that movie. So this is a cool way to add these random patches of differently colored earth. And as a finishing touch, I added some subtle dry brushing with a rain marks effect, a very pale dusty color to make everything look more three-dimensional. It has to be subtle though, otherwise it'll change the overall tone of the ground, especially at the bottom where I wanted to retain the dark, muddy tones. So, that's it, my friends. The diorama is mostly finished, and all that's left are all those small details that make the trench look lived in. I started with the flimsy cans because these require a lot of enamel weathering, and I don't like to spill enamels over painted tarps. In fact, these were weathered using the same methods I'll demonstrate on the suit in a moment. The discarded boot, as well as the tarps, were all painted with acrylics over a base coat made from black brown. And the last prominent detail was the engineering tools, where I had to put some more thought into the still visible print texture. Luckily, some stippling with AK matte paste and some quickly blended enamels did the job, and they made the tools look well used and visually blended them with the diorama. Okay, now we're completely done with the diorama. I'll add some muddy puddles on the ground, but that has to wait until I finish the suit. But yeah, we're done with all the diorama techniques for now. As I said at the beginning, I wanted to paint the suit in a German World War I scheme, and that meant mixing a dull green base coat from Tamiya acrylics. I already painted this color on my A7V, but here I used a completely different recipe for a more desaturated tone with a stronger blue tint. What I quickly realized is that it's much harder to paint this suit compared to my tanks. Lots of complex shapes and, let's be honest, my temporary painting stand wasn't very sophisticated either. You'll see a lot of shaking, but it's not my hands, it's the flimsy stand. Anyway, difficult shapes meant difficult filming of the process, but you can trust me when I say that I painted it using my traditional post-shading method. At first I considered changing my approach and trying how Machine & Krieger modelers do it, for example trying Lincoln Wright's techniques, but then I thought, hey, I wanna see how it's gonna look if I give it my own treatment. Post-shading a free-handed camouflage has never been the easiest task in the world, and it felt extra intimidating on a rounded model that I had to turn around all the time, but after a while, I kinda found my flow, at least more or less. I always liked the bright, colorful stripes used on these models, so I was definitely adding them. White would make more sense on this scheme, but I wanted colors, lots of colors. And because I was expecting a lot of struggle with decals, I covered the entire model with a solid layer of clear Tamiya varnish. Now, this genre has their decal game pretty strong, and they include lots of small markings, tactical numbers, unit insignia, and so on. Some markings seem to me like intentional satire. For example, the label for the Panzerfaust has a shooting suit, and the fumes make it look like the suit is farting. But okay, the real deal was adding my leftover decals and giving the suit a proper World War I look. The only suitable place for the cross was its back, where it actually makes sense as air identification. Decals from Menk are high quality, so I only needed to stipulate a little with VMS decal softener and it looked as if it were painted on the model. The large skull is from Tacom, and it is as thick as you'd expect from this brand. It's not even the thickness of the carrier film that causes the issue, it's the print itself that's very thick, and it was extremely difficult to hammer it into the cast metal surface. Even VMS softener, which is very aggressive, had issues taming this beast of a decal. But hey, after a couple of hours, my struggle was over and I could seal the entire model with a generous coat of VMS flat varnish, making it ready for immediate weathering treatment with enamels. But first, take note of how the color palette of the suit and the diorama are completely mismatched. Warm tones on the ground, desaturated tones on the suit. I'll have to use weathering techniques to visually tie them together. So my first step was pin wash, but let me talk more about the visual consistency while I'm working. I always like to paint and finish the model first, because sometimes the earth tones had to be adjusted for maximum contrast with the model's base coat. For example, you need grayish earth tones on a tank painted in German dark yellow if you want to distinguish the two. Conversely, you may consider using warm, yellowish dust tones over Panzer Gray, otherwise the dust will look like washed down winter camouflage. But once you have the model finished, it's very easy to paint the groundwork accordingly using the same tones and techniques. But here I had the groundwork finished first, so I had to flip my approach on its head and work from the end to the beginning, so to say. Anyway, what I really enjoyed there was using the different pin washes as shadows. This greatly improved the look of the suit, and it's something I never do on tanks because other methods can give me this kind of same result. Although, let's be honest, it's not very desirable on tanks. This is also when I realized that Machine & Krieger suits really are a blend between armor and figures. Basically, you're painting it using armor weathering techniques, but in a way that strongly resembles the painting process on a figure. It's really interesting. The next step in the lineup was chipping. It seems to me that heavy chipping is usually welcome on these models, and it allowed me to try a different paintbrush. Normally I have my favorite Vallejo Kolinsky 000 reserved for chipping and figure painting, but here I tried this number 1 size Marta Kolinsky from 502 Abteilung. It has that nice pointy tip that I appreciate, but it has longer bristles. As a result, it holds more paint and makes it easier to paint random shapes, thus doing a small part of the chipping process for you, so to say. I wanted to try it out because chipping always takes me so much time, but I had to get used to it, and honestly, I wouldn't feel confident enough to try it out for the first time on a tank model. Also, note how I pretty much stopped using the first layer of light superficial chips, because the pale, post-shaded surface provides enough contrast for these rusty steel chips to be easily visible. And although I was afraid that there won't be many places where I could go to town, because everything is just so rounded and there are very few sharp edges, I somehow got used to this model's shape. It definitely adds to its battle-worn appearance and enhances the visual texture. But that's only a part of the process, as enamel rust washes play an equally important role. First off, I treated those details that have a natural steel finish, and they nicely add to the heavy look of the suit. Then it was about blending small amounts of the enamel rust wash around chipping. This subtly blends them into the surface and generally just enhances the worn metal look of any model. It has to be done with care though, because on some colors, in this case the ochre camouflage, it can quickly become overwhelming. However, I wasn't shy with their amount because I was using them to give the suit a warmer look, harmonizing its color palette with the diorama. Note how they can be used to add contrast between different components, in this case visually separating the engine compartment from the main shell of the suit. And in some cases, I could really push the effect to such an extreme that resembles old rusty construction equipment. For example, I can imagine the knee pads would have quite a lot of wear on them, of course depending on how skilled the pilot was. A clumsy pilot would probably trip and fall pretty often. But hey, this is how it looks after pin washes, chipping, rust zones, and some quick detail painting. Quite the difference, isn't it? A part of this is the pale base coat, which makes weathering so much easier and opens up more possibilities for you. Also, check out how it's starting to vibe better with the diorama, but let's push on and finish it with some earth effects. Here I was a bit uncertain because I'm used to tanks and some wheeled vehicles here and there, but this piece of machinery has legs, right? However, I remembered what Lincoln Wright said, and it was something like, keep in mind how the suit moves and where the mud would splash. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. So I figured it would get muddy on the feet, legs and back. Simple enough, right? Actually, yes, that's pretty much it. So I started with the acrylic mud paste from AK and then covered it with the same enamel paints as I used in the diorama. This is the final and most important step that will visually tie them together. I made a small test section on his other leg to see how it was all gonna work, and once I was happy with the result, I went over the entire model with each layer. This means brushing and blending Kursk earth over everything, of course decreasing the amount towards the top, all the while trying to add some interesting effects. These suits are probably just a bit taller than the average human, so I suppose a lot of dirt might accumulate on their heads as well. And I did something I haven't done in a while, mixing the enamel paint with coarse pigment texture from VMS. This turns any color into a thick, gritty compound with a ton of texture. You can use it for stippling, but I love it for speckling and slowly creating that random buildup of splashed mud. So simple, but so cool. But hey, the suit is about to walk in a wet, sloppy trench mud, so I had to add a lot of dark earth tones as well. I used those to add more contrast between parts, but I was quite restrained with the application. A small bit of dark paint over a lighter dry tone goes a very long way once you start blending, and those gritty transitions between dried matte and wet matte are always a visual pleasure. It's also interesting how the ochre camouflage is very similar to the earth tones. It truly changed my opinion, because at first I thought German camouflage was meant to make their armor as obvious and visible on the muddy battlefield as possible. So here's the finished suit, and before I started even painting it, I kept wondering how long was it gonna take to finish. Is it gonna be more tedious like a tank or quick like a small figure? Well, it took me 3 days. So I'd say it's an excellent quick project if you like armor and a little bit of sci-fi. Once I had it firmly superglued in place, I could make the final adjustments at the bottom of the trench. First, I sprayed it with a generous, thick coat of clear Tamiya varnish. This sealed the porous surface while giving it a wet, sloppy look. And now I could add lots of dirty puddles using a dedicated acrylic product from AK called Puddles. The name says it all. It's basically tinted still water, but I like how convenient it is, because you need to apply it in several layers, and it saves you trouble of tinting and color matching every fresh batch of the product. This thing, you just pour it into a cup and you're ready to go. At first I wanted to use epoxy resin, but it's pretty good to have these simpler, quicker tools at our disposal when the effect we want to achieve doesn't require a more involved process. This was my first time working with it, and honestly I had a blast. My patrons kept telling me to add puddles and wet mud, but I was like, yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna feel like it, but yes, it was definitely worth it, and it was a great experience. Not to mention how seamlessly it blends the suit into the muddy ground, right? I mean, what's there not to like? I'd say this little touch completely transformed the diorama and raised it to a new level. So with that out of the way, I could carefully brush the wooden sides with a generous coat of flat black from Tamiya. It's the only color in my experience that's reliable enough, and it always dries to a completely flat finish. And it comes in large bottles, so I don't feel guilty for using it in such large amounts. So anyway, dear friends, I just finished another diorama, or a very large vignette. It kinda depends on your definition. It was something completely different, both in the subject and in the scale, and it took me quite a while to get used to it. I don't know if you found this whole concept of Machine and Krieger in World War I silly or not, but I personally love the idea, and I haven't seen it done online so far. And also, I'm pretty happy with my interpretation of this concept. Machine and Krieger was amongst the top requested subjects on this channel since its beginning, and I always knew that I should add my own spin to it, so I hope you like what I came up with. It took me much longer to finish than I anticipated or planned, partially because everything was bigger and required more work, but I also went on a 4-day trip to Spain with my girlfriend, and we visited the AK offices, where I also filmed a short interview with them, and I also had a bunch of real life stuff that came up out of nowhere, and lastly, I was once again struck with springtime lethargy, and there were some days where I was completely unproductive. In other words, I'm very sorry for keeping you waiting so long, especially if this is not the type of model you were expecting. But also, at the same time, I wanna thank you for being patient with me. My next model is finally going to be a historical tank again, and it's a model I wanted to build for a very, very long time. I bought all the necessary materials for it when I finished that Crusader in 1/48 scale 2 years ago, so it's gonna be one of those projects that are long overdue. And don't worry, that one will be segmented into a full build, full painting and weathering, and full diorama, so you'll get more videos in a shorter amount of time. Until then, I want to sincerely thank you all again for your support and your patience, and a special shout out has to go to my wonderful patrons who make this show possible so I can do this hobby as a full-time job. Thank you, and if you like what I'm doing and would like to get more of it, you can consider joining me on Patreon as well. I'm posting there almost every day with updates from my workbench. We can get in touch through DMs, comments, and emails. I'm posting 1 week early ad-free videos, and these stay there forever so you can always get back to them. I also have a folder full of 3D models which you can download and print for your own projects, such as those flimsy cans that I used in this diorama, a bunch of real-life references for old buildings, various types of terrain, and so on, and last but not least, these high-resolution studio pictures, which I've shot on a completely black background for that enhanced, dramatic look. It would help me a lot, but hey, no pressure. Anyway, friends, Machine and Krieger is a very weird genre, but definitely in a cool sense. As I said, it's a weird blend between armor models and figures, and if you like the retro / alien / weirdly human but also inhuman shape of these suits, then definitely try building one yourself. I'm pretty sure you won't regret it. So now I'm gonna head back to my studio, clean it up, and start working on the next model. And until I'm back with a full build video, you all stay safe, stay awesome, build those models in your stash, don't just collect them, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers!